Good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS and to our event in our continuing series on quantum computing. Today's topic is the future of quantum powering innovation from the private sector. So it's a good topic. And we have two fire engine. We have two excellent speakers. Let me introduce them briefly. Their full bios will be on our website for this event. First is Bob Liscouski. Many of you know Bob, President, CEO, and Chairman of Quantum Computing Incorporated. Since founding the company in 2018, he brings more than 35 years of executive experience at companies and federal agencies, including where many of us met him first as the first Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection at DHS. But he's done many other things, including being on the Intel Science Board. With him is Jay Gambetta, IBM Fellow and Vice President of Quantum Computing at IBM. Jay can tell us what it means to be an IBM Fellow. It's a big deal, but he is named a Fellow in 2018 for his work in superconducting quantum computing and establishing IBM's quantum strategy, and has led the team at IBM that's made a number of major breakthroughs. So with that, let's turn it over to our speakers. And I should point out, I'm going to ask questions. They're going to respond. About 40 minutes or so into the event, you can ask questions too by clicking on the Ask Questions button on the web screen. So with that, let's start. What's the market like for quantum now? I should start with that one because both of you guys are in the private sector. What do you see the market looking like? Jay, do you want to go first?
So the question was, what is the market for quantum computing?
What's the market for quantum now? Who's buying it?
So in my view, so this technology is still getting made, but it's clearly already commercial. So from our perspective, we already have at IBM over 183 clients that are members of our Q network using these systems. A lot of it is in two categories. One is, what will quantum do? How do I get quantum ready? How do I understand the risk? And the second is starting to do some early research and development prototypes. So I would say the market's still emerging from the research and starting to go into the enterprise world. And as we continue to increase what these machines are able to do and simplify how to use them, I expect that market to continue going more and more into very similar wherever computing is needed by enterprise companies.
Right.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jay's characterization of it. I think it's very early stage in terms of a market, right? In fact, I would argue that there's really not a market per se yet, right? We're defining what that market looks like with regard to as the technology begins to emerge into, practical applications. But that being said, we find, on the small company side, a lot of companies looking to explore quantum computing, probably, from a couple of different perspectives. One is curiosity, right? As you point out, Jim, there's been more interest in quantum computing because it's been getting more headlines today. And I think companies, particularly, larger companies, are looking to figure out what kind of budget they need to be allocating. And by that, they have to first explore what quantum computing may or may not be able to do for them. And then there are those that are committed to it to the point where they actually are looking for solutions. I'm sure we'll be talking about some of those things, but folks who are actually interested in trying to apply quantum techniques or quantum technologies into their particular problem space. We're finding on the software side, we're making some sales. The hardware obviously is emerging and pretty rapidly, depending upon who you speak with in regard to their own development. But I don't want to dominate here, but I just want to say, I think as we begin to see more technology actually showing promise in terms of what it may produce, you'll see greater uptake by the user community. And that as a consequence, it's going to continue to force the cycle for hardware development. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
So that leads into the question of what's sort of the timeline for this as a commercial application? What's the I was actually on my notes. It says glide path, but
Hmm.
are we looking at end of the decade? Are we looking in the 2030s? I mean, if you're already seeing people exploring it, what do you think the timeline is for this?
If I may, so I'm going to come in. We know it's great. We've got IBM, arguably the largest provider in the world, right? And you've got companies like mine, which is arguably on this very small side of the scale. But and the only reason I make those distinctions is because while we're coming at it from two different points of view from the company resources, I think the intent here, in terms of trying to drive to the end game, is no less intense. From our point of view, if you poll the industry, you have everything from the next few years to the next, maybe within the decade, you may see some sort of quantum advantage. And I think people have different definitions for what that really may be. We tend to stay more focused, less on the hype and more on the practical aspects of it. And, we drive toward the solutions end. And I believe that we're going to start seeing this uptake in solutions. I don't think you're ever going to see a flip the switch sort of, hey, we're here, and quantum computing is now achieving what it's intended to be achieving. I think it's going to be gradual. And you're going to see, different industries, whether they be pharma, supply chain, optimization in general, or AI, you're going to see different uptakes there that are going to require or ultimately result in different successes using quantum technologies. So we'll probably look back in 20 years and say, oh, that was the moment that happened. But trying to predict when that moment's going to happen, I think is going to be very difficult.
Jay, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
I think mine is very similar. I would say my view is the timeline. We already have. I already say we already have commercial. Like we have paying clients using the system, and it continues to grow in demand. If I plot it, it's exponential, like how much these systems get used. I think recently it's like 4 billion circuits. So I think it's already here, but I think it's more about a continuous timeline of innovation that keeps bringing more and more capabilities to these machines. That's why I've made publicly a roadmap from the hardware, because it talks about how we're going to solve different technical problems. And that's one axis. And then the second axis is we have to bring this technology, and I like to say make it frictionless. What that means is easier for people to use. If you're going to increase the funnel of users today, the hardware is really, I send these things that we call them quantum circuits. They're like got the analogy to assembly language of classical to the machines. We're starting to go up to the next thing of how we can just like, I call it a runtime, but essentially you can think of it as giving instructions to run a series of instructions and return process results to the users, so they can mix that body of instructions with classical calculations and start doing algorithms. And that's just starting off, and very soon we'll have to be, and I like to say that enables a new cohort of users that focus on algorithm developer. And then the next is going to be how we bring quantum to where the data is, as Robert suggested, and start to define solutions. And I think that will kick into high gear in the 2023. So this to me is about a journey, not a timeline. I think commercial is here. It's about a journey of opening up the funnel to more and more users that get different value out of the machines.
Yeah, I would add to that, Jim, if I may too, is that
sure.
When we stop talking about hardware and we start talking about the solutions, I think you'll know that you'll have reached that point where there's been this transition into quantum, some sort of quantum expectation of advantage. The user community is growing, as Jay points out, and the expectations that are rising in terms of what quantum can do, in terms of their understanding of what they can get out of it. While the technology may be complex and difficult to understand for a layman, at the business level, people become less concerned about the actual hardware that's producing the solution and actually focus on the solution themselves. When they can actually do things that classical computers cannot do today, or at least may have difficulty doing, and they can start answering those problems that they have in better ways with higher fidelity in the results, then we'll know we'll have crossed that sort of threshold.
What do we need to teach people to do to use quantum? I mean, quantum programming looks, at least at a very cursory level, very different from classic programming. Will there be translator programs or quantum as a service? What do we need to teach people to use quantum?
So I probably can start. My view is we don't need to teach them a new language. We need to bring libraries and runtime like tools into standard languages and standard ways of programming as we focus on understanding what the user type is. Like we've said a few times, I think there's going to be this transition. And so today, yes, from the lowest level, you need to define an assembly language. We call it an intermediate representation that represents the instructions sent to the quantum computer. But we need to go as quick as we can to abstract that away to get exactly like you have in classical computing. You see when people use GPUs, if they're doing simple matrix multiplication, there's a simple library that will do that. If they're in TensorFlow, they don't even need to say that it's going on a GPU, just get the best hardware to do it.
Right.
So as we develop and get those smart abstraction layers that focus really on the domain and knowledge of those different developers on their journey, my goal is how do we bring quantum to computing? I actually prefer to think of it as we're not replacing computing, we're extending what it means to be compute by bringing quantum processors to it. And if we can have that philosophy, then it's about how do we bring that new math that is enabled through quantum computing into the standard way of programming a computer.
Yeah. So again, I'm not surprised. We're very similar in our perspectives. We started off as a software company and we're hardware agnostic. And I'm not trying to sell what we're doing just from a platform point of view. We intended to provide, and not to disintermediate the need for quantum programming, but if you look at the landscape, and this is a multi-dimensional problem, but there are not a lot of quantum physicists who can program quantum computers. Right? And if we're going to really scale this up, we have to have less emphasis on the higher order computing programming requirements and allow the software to do that. And that's the path that we took. And others are taking the same path to provide that approach, to provide end users the ability to interface with those machines without having to have the resources necessarily to be able to program at toolkit level. And that allows you to be able to do, obviously a variety of things. What we've done with the agnostic approach is allow the user to select which machines they want to, because currently in the current state, not all quantum computers are equal and they don't treat the problems the same way, and they'll come up with better, and some will treat different problems better than others. So depending upon the types of problems you have, you want to be able to select the QPU that you're actually going to be running that problem on to optimize that result. And the only way you really can do that is looking at the platform approach, a problem, a software set that is agnostic at the QPU level and allows the user to be able to interface with that.
So it's a little off topic, but this sounds a lot like the early days of supercomputing, probably 40 or 50 years ago, where you had almost bespoke computers,
right,
or at least classes of computers. You had DEC, you had IBM, you had others. And each of them had a slightly different language that you had to master to get results out of them. Is that kind of the path we're on? Is that a good analogy? I like the assembly language metaphor. It's a good way to think about this.
So this is probably where we differ a little. I think the only thing that needs to be run on quantum hardware is a quantum circuit, and that's the assembly language. And there's a well-defined description of that. And this and what matters for that is that I can run a quantum circuit of sufficient size, quality, and speed. And if my hardware can deliver the quality and whatever can deliver the quality and speed of that then becomes the part that gets embedded into the abstraction layers we're talking about. And so I see us we need from the low level, we need to focus on how we make these circuits run faster and with higher quality, and be it integrating error mitigation, error suppression techniques, and eventually error correction into it. My goal is, I try not even to say hardware. I think of all of that as a closed up package that I put together and then that goes into higher abstraction layers. And what a user needs to know is the libraries, and then is the circuits that I can run able to run with sufficient quality and speed and size.
Did you want to add to that, Bob? Or
no, I think it's well said. I think I think the important point here is the de-emphasis on the interface to the hardware, allowing the users to be able to run their problems and not have to work on the formulation of the problem, not necessarily the interface on the machine.
So who wants to tell me what quantum advantage is? We've used it a couple times in this conversation.
Well, I always say very simply, I want to be able to do something cheaper, faster, or more accurate than classically in at least two of them. Mm-hmm. If I can't do that, I'm not sure I can articulate the business value. Like, I can run something faster that's got zero accuracy. It may not be useful for anything. So I like to focus on, I need to be able to do something cheaper, faster, or more accurate, and at least two of them. And I'm okay if I can achieve just two of them, and I can articulate that into the use case and business value of it. I don't see quantum advantage as a point in time. I see it as something we'll look back and have many examples of it. And my focus is, our team's focus is, keep building the quantum computer. The quantum computer, so it can run the capabilities to allow us to explore all these various different quantum advantages that will emerge over time.
Yeah, and I think the key point here is that the definition of advantage, I refer to it just in a general term. There is no specific point that I think you'll point to. I think Jay, when he mentioned, there's this going to be hybrid model between classical and quantum that is going to leverage the best of both worlds. So the clear advantage here is going to be when you can optimize the results between those two worlds and divide the problems up, run those things classically that can do well classically, run those things quantumly that quantum can provide that capability for, and you come up with a better answer. I hate to sound like a little bit of a broken record here, but the emphasis here is really on the solutions, right? It's when you get better problem sets, or you have certain problem sets that you get better solutions for. That's what the business community cares about, and the academic community for that matter. They don't. And I don't want to speak for them, but I mean, from my point of view, the folks I speak with don't even talk about quantum advantage. They just talk about being able to do things better that they can't do today.
What are people doing now with quantum computers? I mean, what are the clients doing with them? Is it preparation? Is it playing around? I mean, what do you see that? What's actually going on in the business user world for quantum computing?
Yeah, so from our point of view, it's, I'm sure, much more narrow than the IBM perspective, but we're dealing with users that are particularly interested in the optimization space. That was our initial focus, was looking at ways that we could enhance the optimization capabilities. So that referred to things like autonomous driving, being able to use sensor placement for more efficient sensors on vehicles and do things like that. That seems to be a real key area. And then of late, logistics and supply chain, of course, supply chain optimization to be able to figure out, getting goods in the marketplace, more pedestrian types of problems that sound pedestrian, but they're fairly complex in terms of packing and inventory controls and things like that. So I can only define it based upon the folks we're dealing with. There's the areas that I'm pushing into. We just did a recent acquisition of a hardware company, so it kind of opens up the aperture for us. But AI and ML are areas of particular interest, particularly it relates to my old domain within the context of DHS was risk management and trying to do risk analysis and predictive analysis and problem sets that are far more complex because of the numbers of variables that are involved in that. And I think there's a significant opportunity on the risk management side. Then, of course, you look at all the other domains between drug development, as an example, as another area of particular interest, and then the fintech space, another optimization problem. But the folks we're finding to be this has most traction with is supply chain logistics and the autonomous vehicle area.
So Yeah. So I like to try and answer this question by first. What we're seeing is, as I said, there's these quantum circuits. They're the fundamental, and what we're observing is kind of three sort of buckets that they fall in. One bucket is, can I simulate nature better? Be it chemistry, biology, material science, or even high energy physics. So since quantum gives you a more efficient way of representing nature, we put it in that bucket. And obviously that's inspired by a lot of what Feynman originally proposed quantum computing. The second is I like to put in a bucket of dealing with data with some type of structure or correlations that are hard to see. Can I find these correlations and structure? Most because quantum is really good at seeing about if I can see correlations or if I can represent different types of structure in some type of group, then we can put them into that bucket. And I'll say examples of the businesses that are doing it. Then the third, which is hard because it gets confused a lot, is optimization and search. And that uses different types of circuits to do it. So if we go by those three buckets, in the first, we have a lot of companies that are interested in chemistry, be it simulating catalysts, be it simulating better batteries, lighter wings, better of understanding spectra, like the vibrational spectroscopy of molecules and things like that. So there's a lot of, if you can solve these type of problems, it makes it a lot easier for those type of industries. So we have many industries working on that. With the data with structure, this is where we've put a lot of our own investment into how do we extend AI by quantum kernels and things like that. And that extends into multiple areas, like you can think of, can you do cyber forensics or fraud detection, a few different companies looking at that type of area, or can even in the health and sort of understanding correlations and how machine learning applies to health data. I was surprised, and now that we've started, a lot of those companies have got interested. I think that's a really interesting area. Those correlations are really difficult. Maybe the quantum reveals something about that structure that is hard to do classically, and it's very much worth exploring. And then in the optimization, even though it may not give you an exponential speed up, generally optimization problems, if you want to optimize, it's always best to hire a lot of mathematicians, but generally we just run a simple optimization and it does pretty good. Quantum gives you a slight difference in that, and even though the best case, it might only be a polynomial speed up, it's worth exploring that polynomial speed up to see what it applies. And so combined within the optimization, as Bob said, there's examples in logistics, and that. And I forgot, in the finance, they're very interested in the data with structure as well, of course. So I think those three areas, seen a lot of finance companies in the data with structure, a lot of chemistry or materials in the simulated nature, in the health side, understanding what it can do with the data with structure and optimization. So I see us generating libraries, those libraries starting to get developed into use cases. And then I see in the next year or so, a lot of solutions starting to emerge.
There are some other practical applications as well, I think. Some areas outside of the pure computational side, or quantum LiDAR, and then quantum networks, of course. We start talking about entanglement and the ability to set up quantum networks is also an area that there's been a lot of interest. But there are some practical applications on the LiDAR side that have already demonstrated some utility. So it's not just purely computational, the computational space.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say all of those are interesting, but the couple ones piqued my interest immediately, which was if you think about at this point, some years ago when computing and data came to the financial world, how that changed it when you think of investment companies and what they do now and high-speed trading. So that's something we have to look forward to on this, but it takes a while to figure out how to do it. What are the risks there? I mean, if you remember, what was it, long-term capital? one of the early innovators in combining computing and big data for financial prediction. They made some mistakes. What should we look forward here in the quantum world? Same kind of thing, or have we learned enough to dodge that kind of error?
Who do you want to go first?
Please, Jay, go right ahead.
So I think one of the ones I would say we should try and dodge is big data. I don't think big data and quantum necessarily go together. I think you're not going to load data into a quantum part. What quantum's going to do is do a lot on like the hard math that you may want to do on the data. But I think in general, how we go forward is we need to be aggressive and get this out, but also be open and get many people testing it. But I'm sure we're going to make a few mistakes along the path. But the promise of a machine that is capable of doing math that really impacts a lot of problems that are essential for us to try and get solutions and solve is worth the risk. But I think having an open and that's why I try to do roadmap of where this technology is, so it doesn't get ahead. We don't get too ahead of ourselves is the most important thing to avoid any potential problems that may arise.
So, I'll kind of give you an indirect answer too, Jim. I think, we're at such an early stage in this industry. I know if you can go back 50 years to where the more, the classical computing space really started taking off, trying to predict at that point what was going to happen, to today, right? If, fast forward 50 years, you say, well, I never would have expected these types of outcomes. I would have expected more of this on the more traditional scale. But then you have this orthogonal thing, this thing came out of left field that happened, right? Because people started using the technology in ways we couldn't begin to imagine. I think quantum is going to be exactly the same way, right? I mean, past this prologue here, the human nature aspect of being able to take a technology, and you have people who are kind of deeply embedded in the technology trying to get from point A to point B. And then all of a sudden you'll have people that are just going to take that technology when it gets to a certain point and do things with it you've never dreamed of, right? That's the exciting part. I think that we can't even begin to predict what some of those outcomes are going to look like. But except with and I would make one prediction. Something really interesting is going to happen in 20 years with quantum technologies combined with classical computing, right? Because it's going to. I mean, we know that even if we, park all the hype, we take all the hype that's been going on in the industry, and it's all the promise of quantum computing today will never be, won't be realized today. May not be realized in 10 years, 20 or 30 years. That hype is going to seem like just even a pipe dream at the point, because it's going to surpass whatever it's going to be. That's the one constant I think we can count on with technology. It's going to surpass whatever we think it's going to do, but it won't do whatever we think it's going to do tomorrow, right? It's going to go way beyond that. And it's exciting because when you think about, and there's a lot of ethical issues. There's a lot of national security issues. I don't know if you want to bump into those things, but we are really just in the crawling stage here. And so whatever is going to happen in the future is, like I said, sorry to be redundant, it's going to be incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in serendipity. And so one of the things I always think about is how do you construct, and Bob, you've done a lot of work on this, how do you construct a governance system, a regulatory system that maximizes serendipity? Because a lot of times people don't know what they're going to do until they play with it for a little while. So, and Jay, when you brought up artificial intelligence, as you know, many people in many countries get excited about artificial intelligence and the grave risk, the grave risk of AI becoming Terminator-like or something, or Skynet. What do we need to do? Do we need to worry about regulation or restriction? And I think there's two parts of that. Let's do the first part, which is general regulation, general restriction. I don't hear you guys making a case for it, but maybe I'm wrong. The second one does touch on national security, which is export controls. And that's definitely under consideration. But let's start with general regulation. Is this R&D that we should just let it blossom and not worry about it now, or what would you say?
Well, I have a definite opinion about that. You may not agree with it. It's conflicted. if you regulate now, you're gonna stifle innovation, right? I think the innovation that's coming out of the industry today is what's going to propel it going forward, right? It's not just in the big companies, but it's small little. It still is a small little garage types, right? And I mean, they're not in a garage; they're in a lab someplace at some university where you've got some really brilliant physicists that's out there doing things that ultimately bring some innovation to it. And you don't want to regulate that. I think that will kill an industry. At the same time, this is the confliction. You have a real national security issue here. I think, when we think about what quantum computing is going to be able to do, irrespective of whether you think it may result in some AI that can't be controlled or what have you, but even if short of that, it's a national security issue. You have the encryption, decryption issues, right? You've got all sorts of things going on that nation states are working really hard to try to achieve. That once they achieve those things, could potentially give them a very big competitive advantage. And the challenge we have in the United States is, we don't have, this is a workforce development thing. We don't have the workforce that's necessarily going to be able to supply the needed talent here that we can say, is grown organically. And we wind up importing a lot of that workforce from foreign nations that ultimately we could turn right around, then they can take that IP and that intellectual capital back to help those nation states. That's a challenge, right? That's a real national security challenge. And not thinking this may not be a good comparison, but if you think about what the nuclear age did to the world, but the barrier to entry to the nuclear age was pretty sufficient, right? It's just, or significant rather, right? So you don't have that within the quantum space today. It's an educational challenge. And it's a money challenge, but money can be solved, right? And so you give people access, and you could be doing things that have a national security implication that, if they're not governed well, if they're not necessarily controlled appropriately, we could be accelerating the pace of some other, smaller nation states' acceleration of the quantum space without even thinking about it. And that's worrisome.
Yeah, so it's a complicated topic, and I think you have to have a lot of discussion. One of the things because quantum, the algorithm that we're touching on here, Shor's algorithm, one of the most successful ones to ever be to come up, and it's a beautiful mathematical algorithm. Does imply breaking encryption. It's important to have the discussion, but I think it's also important to realize at the same time we can innovate on how we protect encryption as well, how we get quantum safe. So what I really like seeing is, how do we continue at the same way driving what it means to be compute and continue to drive what it means to keep security. And so I think by pushing on the limits of that and pushing at the same time what it is to compute and what it is to make quantum safe technology, and that's a philosophy that we've definitely taken at IBM, is the best way going forward. And then I think the other side is making sure we continue to have discussions on these topics, but let's not get ahead of where the technology is. So my advice is, yes, we should all be transitioning to quantum safe algorithms as quick as possible, because this technology doesn't imply that it can break standard encryption. But at the same time, let's make sure we use how this technology can enhance what it means to compute and understand what that is, because compute is so fundamental to our lives that we need to keep pushing that. And so I think if we approach it in a smart way, pushing on both and continue discussing with all the right stakeholders, we can manage this without getting ahead of ourselves and putting restrictions that are going to slow us down.
Yeah, we had NIST on probably 3 or 4 episodes ago to talk about post-quantum encryption.
Yeah.
So they do seem to be doing pretty well at that. But the fear here is what Bob was talking about, which is a lack of deep understanding, perhaps, of what the Chinese are doing. And so I usually make fun of technological surprise, but this is the one place where it could happen. We have to, where do you assess, who are your competitors? Who are you looking at when you look overseas? I've talked to the Chinese a couple times, not recently, about where they are in quantum, and I think they're making a major effort and doing some good work. So where do you see the competition in this?
Is that to me?
Sure. That's what you get for speaking up.
So as a private company, we make sure that we're innovating and we secure ours. I don't see any companies that are overseas. I think there's a lot to go, but I think they're a few years behind where we are in this technology. I think the only way to make sure that we continue to be leading in this technology is continue investing and continue creating the quantum industry. To be honest, I worry less about who's competing and how we actually go as fast as we can. And we do, and of course, make sure that our hard-earned IP is protected and allow us to go forward. So I don't actually spend that much time thinking about the overseas competitors. I try to put most of my time on how we actually advance along this technology and make it useful.
Yeah, so that's where I can, so as a CEO of a company, I'm not the technologist, right? So I've got folks who really worry about what Jay's talking about. What I worry about, too, is the protection of our IP. And I would not just worry about it from our point of view, but I do look at, and again, I'm a small company person, so I'll tell you, I believe innovation is coming from small companies. And if you look at a lot of the startups that are out there, and the IP that's being developed, those companies are so nascent in terms of their evolution. They're not spending money on protection. They're spending money on buying, bringing people, hiring people, innovating, right, doing all the things that they do. And oh, by the way, there may be some protection on it, but there's likely not very good protection. So while the Chinese are investing and others are investing significant amount of resource dollars into developing their own quantum space, I worry about the ability to pluck, some really interesting IP from companies that are very, very innovative, very unique, and then potentially hold the key to something that somebody else from a bigger, nation state's working on that could make a difference. And that's difficult to protect against. But I think to the point of your point about technological surprise, Jim, I think that's where it's going to come from. I really do. I think the innovation that comes out of these small companies and the inability to protect them well is where they're going to potentially give somebody else an advantage. And they won't even know that they've done it, right? If it's done well, you steal the IP without even knowing the target's been compromised. And you've come from that space, so you know that really well, right? So I don't know how you protect against that. And that's why I said earlier on, when you talked about regulation, if we regulate that, you'll stifle the innovation. You'll protect it. But it's almost a classic denial of service approach, where if you want to be safe from a network attack, you unplug from the network and you've accomplished the same problem the folks from doing the DNS attacks are doing, right? So you've got to be careful about how far you swing this pendulum. And there's really no good answer. It's just, I think, an awareness of what the problems look like. Because most companies don't have the resources of an IBM to protect themselves. Most companies are coming at it with, if you have to choose investing $1 in security or investing $1 in resources to be able to develop technology, it's going to be the latter, not the former.
Sure. No, that makes sense. We're starting to get questions from the audience, but let me push the foreign line a little bit more. Where do you see uptake overseas? I know the Germans have announced a quantum initiative, and I think they're using sort of quantum as a service. It's not like they have their own quantum computing, but they access it. Where do you see the European Union, other places, not on the security side, but just on commercial uptake? Same interest, different. What's it look like overseas?
So I have a worldwide strategy. I do, and the way we choose that strategy is related to the previous question, and we focus on making sure that we drive. I see quantum as an industry, not just a technology, and how we create this industry is fundamental for us going forward. And so we have partnerships in Germany. We've installed a system in Germany. So we've built we have one of our IBM quantum system ones in Germany that is used in a partnership with the Fraunhofer Institute, that is used basically 100% of the time. We have another one in Japan, which we've installed, and it is similar with the University of Tokyo, and it has many of the local industries that are contributing to it. We've announced another one with South Korea, and our goal is to bring a quantum computer there. And we've announced another one with Canada and Quebec, and we'll be installing a system there. And so when I think of these strategic partnerships, I always think in four things. How do we actually advance this as a quantum industry by driving the right R&D on new applications? How do we create the workforce, which is actually a really important topic, which we haven't touched much on. And then the third is you need access to these. So how do we bring that access through quantum systems to them? And the fourth is creating the industry. And there's three different ways. How do we create software on top of it? How do we continue to create consumers of this, of quantum computing? And the third is, at the moment, a lot of the parts that go into the systems we build. That has to change as we go forward. We need to get a robust supply chain that is delivering components that I can assemble into the systems. You take a mobile phone, there are components such as circulators in there that are miniaturized. The circulators which we use in the systems today are really big devices. So how, by understanding this as an industry, do we actually build amplifiers, electronics, circulators, cabling, eventually the motherboard, and how do all these components come so that I can take the processors we build with the other components and assemble the systems? And so we've done a lot of strategic partnerships like that around the world as we create this strategic industry. And of course, we also have US-based ones.
So Jim, if I may take a slightly different perspective on that. So there are a number of different ways of achieving the same result with quantum computing, but using different technologies, everything from, as superconducting or ion trap or even photonics. And they have different infrastructure requirements. You look at the D-Wave annealer, obviously, is a different machine. We've recently gone down the photonics route. And we've done an acquisition of machine that is a room temperature quantum computing. So the infrastructure requirements are not as daunting as they are in some of the superconducting space. And there are other companies and countries out there in the world that are doing similar types of things. So to your question, I think it's depending upon the types of technologies that ultimately are being invested in by that country. And then what the goal is. And I think the quantum as a service, I do believe, is going to be ultimately the dominant approach in the beginning until the infrastructure, if it's photonics, infrastructure is not an issue. But the question of how many people are actually how many companies are going to buy a quantum computer, or do they just need access to it? You look at the Amazon approach with Bracket, and they provide access to IonQ, D-Wave, and Rigetti, via their platform, and they're adding a few others. They just want to, they're not betting on one horse; they're betting on a number of them, and I think the industry is going to be pushing into that direction because, like I said earlier, not one computer is going to provide the answers to any particular problem, at least for a while. So I think the service approach, the cloud-based approach, is going to be the way that the industry is going to be expecting to gain access to those quantum computers.
Yeah, I think we can talk about cloud some other time, but that's where I would bet if I was betting.
Yeah,
I was not saying cloud. Obviously, we have the first and we have the largest. But as you put a system in the countries, what it means to have a cloud and what it means to have it coupled to their other architectures and where that data goes becomes an important question. And every one of these systems we put, they're managed services that provide quantum computing cloud spread around the world. When
you say where that data goes, what do you mean?
Data understanding data and the path of the data and how they there's no such thing as a quantum computer that doesn't work with a classical computer. This is completely a myth. Quantum and classical have to go together from the start. How you put the information in, how you actually analyze it. And there's various different classical times, from real time in the FPGAs to where error mitigation is done and eventually error correction will be done, to HPC. And so the whole data sort of where data transfers, the architecture of the data is a complicated topic that many want to have that discussion. And so when you just say the word cloud, it's like, what does the cloud mean? It's a delivery of a service, and understanding that data architecture as well as the compute power and where that compute is done, whether it's on the quantum processor or the classical, is a very complicated topic. And I see a future with many quantum data centers around the world that are delivering quantum solutions, and there'll be lots of different requirements into the different pieces.
Yeah, data is one of the categories of questions I hope we have time to get to. We may not. And I do want to talk about workforce when we talk about government's role. But let me tackle a couple of the questions we've gotten from the audience. One is easy, or at least it's easy to ask Jay. The other one's a little more broad aperture. Question: where do you see the most exciting quantum applications in the short term? Communications, sensing, computing. If you had to pick one.
That's easy. I actually think, well, it's easy, and then I'll contradict myself. I see it as computing. However, if we're going to make progress in defining what it means to compute, communication becomes essential. Like, I'm not going to just we're not going to make bigger and bigger processors that fit on a single chip. We're going to have to make clusters of quantum processors. Those clusters of quantum processors can be inside one fridge, or they could be fridge to fridge. So progress in pushing the limit is going to drive communication and processors together. And then I could even imagine a future long-term out where you will want to get optical information into a processor. And once you start to do that, you're now coupling your processor to the external world. And so whilst it's not sensing in the traditional sense, I think of it all around, I want to process quantum information. I do want to make something that does the calculations really fast, but to extend and grow, I'm going to have to introduce communication between those processes. And eventually I'm going to have to introduce different ways of getting information. But my initial answer is computation. But I see them as all one thing, which is, how do we do quantum information processing?
Do you want to add to that, Bob?
Well, I would, yeah. I mean, I think, again, I don't want to sound like we're kind of mutually in total agreement here, but I think I see a lot of promise in sensing and communications for the same reason that Jay is talking about here. I think the application of these technologies, I think sensing offers probably the lowest hanging fruit from some of the things I've seen in terms of real terms application. I mentioned LiDAR previously. I think that there's an area of significant promise to that I think has some commercial viability to it.
So this is the question I thought would be easy for Jay. It's very specific. They didn't tell me who sent the question, but it's, where is IBM at with their timeline to release the 433 qubits IBM Quantum Osprey processor? You can dodge that one if you want.
No, we're on track. My goal is to say more about it at the annual event that we have when I released the Eagle. But the 433, we're definitely on track, and I think it's going to be nice as we continue to push. And I think we just made an announcement earlier on how we're extending the roadmap, and I think some of those ideas of how we're going to scale the technology, we're very excited about that, and how we add to them as we go forward in the roadmap. So I'm not giving the exact date, but stay tuned, and it is planned to be by the end of this year.
Okay, that was a good answer. Two more questions. What do companies need to do to be quantum ready? What would you advise them?
So
go for it.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think I'll look at it from sort of the things we've been looking at that companies express themselves mostly is it really depends upon the size of the company. Let's say it's a mid-tier to larger company. The amount of technology resources they need to be dedicating toward quantum has to be, just enough to explore their big problems internally that can benefit from quantum, and understand the correlation between those problems and where quantum technologies are ultimately going to contribute to, a solution. So go back to the worlds, that we talked about earlier, supply chain logistics companies. There are things there that can be done. I think that if companies aren't thinking about them today, they need to be very focused on understanding where, better technologies, better computing capabilities are going to contribute to their outcomes that they're looking to achieve. And it doesn't have to be a significant investment in resources. It can be exploratory. Companies like ours, obviously IBM, there are a myriad of companies out there that are looking to get folks at least sensitized to what quantum computing can do, and try to run those problems on quantum computers. Understand what it takes to actually formulate a problem that can be transferred to a quantum computer. And most of these things can be done classically, even using quantum techniques to be prepared for the quantum eventuality. I think companies that want to be competitively advantaged, if they wait for the industry to actually realize those advantages, they'll be behind the curve, and they'll be if they're even in business by the time that happens, it's going to be it won't be long before they're out of it if they really don't start taking the steps to become quantum oriented. But it doesn't require a significant amount of resources. You don't have to hire quantum experts, and there are professional services approaches that give both leadership as well as technologists the understanding of what they need to think about their businesses that can get quantum enabled.
So my answer is very similar. If I'll give a bite to, we advise that everyone should have a small team understanding quantum and start to investigate how it does from a computing lens. And if encryption is important to your business, you should be asking the question, do I need to have quantum safe put into it? So asking the question, if encryption is important, of what are the implications of quantum safe? And computing is so important to everything, you should have a small team. I wouldn't advise getting a very large team to understand how the ideas and to do with one of the various different companies, exploratory we like to call them proof of technology. So prove an experiment where you do some proof of technology for some use case or something like that, so you can understand the implications for this to your business as this technology matures.
So the small team leads us to the question about workforce and how you build the quantum workforce. And the topic heading I had this under was, how should the US government help? Is this a government thing where they need to invest? Is it what we've done in other sciences, or is it something else? But how do we build that workforce? And then the larger question of what is the USG role in quantum computing? Let's start with workforce. What would you do?
Well, I think the National Science Foundation is doing, I'd say, a pretty good job at trying to encourage workforce development through the academic, obviously, the world. They have to think more in the solutions than they had to think about the hardware. It's just my viewpoint, right? I tend to, again, be very end user focused. But I see it. I see it in a number of universities. Every major, even most universities today have some semblance of a physics program that looks at, what quantum computing is going to be doing today. The major universities obviously have quantum centers. The NSF has been sponsoring a number of quantum centers to see that. The NIST program is doing a pretty good job at getting the word out there and getting companies to, bring in resources to understand what quantum computing can do. It is workforce. I think, we have to really emphasize, and this goes back to your point about the U.S. government's concern. I think we really do have to emphasize the need for, U.S. trained and, U.S. born, U.S. trained workforce. I do believe that the dependency today we have on foreign students, because that's the culture they're coming from in terms of their their own scientific background and their ability to be prepared for the rigor of the hard sciences is an emphasis that we haven't really made enough in the United States before. And I think we're going to be hurting for that, and that's going to have an impact because this is going to scale, right? Today, Jay, I don't know what your experience is in terms of finding people, but there are more and more scarce resources out there to find for programming. The cost is going up. So that tells me, it's obviously a supply and demand problem. And then if you layer on top of that the national security implications and wanting to get, folks who can stay here, it's great to have them come from foreign countries, get them trained up, keeping them here rather than allowing them to take that going back and going back to their home country is a challenge for us. So, but I think more emphasis has to be placed on it. I think what we're doing today in the government's a good start. I don't think it's anywhere near as much as what we need to be doing.
Yeah. So I'll add as well. I think it's a good start. I like to say you need to reskill, upskill, and skill people. So we need to continue to get it into universities to keep skilling. I'd like to see more transitioning from physics to computer science, not saying stopping in physics, but add computer science. I think we need to focus on how we upskill a lot of people already in the industry. We've had a great example of that internally, but getting that and working out how you can upskill, I think is an important. And to reskill the current workforce and initiatives, I would like to see more focused how you take someone from a slightly different domain and get them into from say I don't know, maybe AI or some other domain in the industry and get them reskilled in quantum. I think we're underdoing things in that area, right? Like if we could do some focus on reskilling, because there are a lot of well-trained people in different domains as this technology matures to this area, I think that's as important as training at the universities.
Let me just follow that one a little bit, because in other areas, reskilling has turned out to be difficult. How difficult will it be for quantum?
So I think there are it depends where they're coming from. I think because we're growing this and we're going into new domains, I think there is this way to take people with more applied knowledge and bring them in, and their skills get added with the quantum actually helps us go faster. I think as we mature, the difficulty is going to go up. Mm. But right now, we're still coming out of we're abstracting to higher levels. That I think there is an opportunity to do it now, because there isn't these people that are really trained as solutions that know exactly all the possible methods in the domain. We're trying to get it more applied, and so it's the right time to do it.
Great. Bob, any final words?
So, the theme I've been stressing here is end user, getting folks to become more demanding of what the technologies can do. The analog I always use, or maybe the metaphor I use is, smartphones, the development of the flip phone and the smartphone, and how that technology all of a sudden appeared in your hand. And, this is not just mine, this is well known in the industry, right? So the applications that came on those phones really, force users, not force them, attracted users to be able to do things with a phone they could never do before. And then you had this virtuous cycle of technology development and user, satisfaction, and it just kept spiraling to where we are today. I believe that that's exactly what's going to happen. The more applications we can put in front of people that have a quantum touch to them, that have a quantum nexus, that really deliver results that they can't achieve otherwise, is going to cause that demand to happen, right? And it will be demand driven. Right now, like I said, it's an industry driven, I'm convincing folks that quantum computing technology is the way to go because that's the next wave of the future. 90% of the people out there still today in the business community don't understand computer technology. When they go out to the cloud, they have no idea what's on the other end of that line. All they know is they make a query, they can do things, they get some data back, they can make better decisions, and boom, it happens. Quantum technology is going to be exactly the same way. It's going to be behind the scenes. When it's ultimately successful, you won't know if you're touching a classical computer, a quantum computer, or some mice running around a cage someplace that can produce an answer. You want that fidelity of an answer, that better business outcome. That's where we're focused. I believe that's when the industry really turns that corner. I think we'll actually have, we'll start achieving the things that we're looking to do. It's an exciting time because I think we can shape a lot of that today. But we've got to do the crawl, walk, run approach, and we're still very much in the crawl phase.
Well, this has been great. It sort of highlights something I'm increasingly convinced of. The economies that do well in the future will be those that have a deep coding base, and also the entrepreneurs and innovators who can come up with the applications that use, whether it's quantum or AI or 5G. And that might be a place where the US could use a little bit of an accelerant, but we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered applications. Didn't get as much on data as might have been useful, but the implications for data and quantum, the connection to AI, hybrid computing. Jay, Bob, thank you for doing this. It was a great event. And thanks to everyone in the audience.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.